There is a face that has haunted the world for 3,000 years. Carved from limestone and painted with colors that had defied 33 centuries of darkness and dust. A long neck, high cheekbones, lips curved in an expression that sits precisely between serenity and command. A tall blue crown rising above features so perfectly proportioned that modern artists and scientists who have studied it cannot fully explain why it produces, in virtually every human being who sees it, the same visceral response and intake of breath. A moment of absolute stillness. The recognition that something extraordinary has been encountered. The bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the ruins of an ancient Egyptian sculptor's workshop in 1912, is one of the most reproduced images in all of human art history. It has appeared on postage stamps and cinema posters, and fashion magazine covers and political protest banners. It has been called the most beautiful woman in history. It sits today in the News Museum in Berlin, disputed, celebrated, irreplaceable, and it draws more visitors per year than almost any other artifact in the world. But the face is not the story. The face is only the beginning. Because Nefertiti, the woman whose cheekbones the whole world recognizes, was not merely beautiful. She was not merely a pharaoh's wife, not merely a consort elevated to prominence by proximity to male power. She was a co-ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. She was a religious revolutionary. She was a political architect of extraordinary ambition and capability. She may have ruled Egypt alone, under a different name, after her husband's death. And she disappeared from the historical record so completely, her name erased, her images defaced, her memory systematically destroyed by the forces that came after her, that for most of recorded history, no one even knew she had existed. The Egypt she inhabited and helped to rule was the most magnificent civilization the ancient world had yet produced. The 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. The period historians call the height of Egyptian imperial power was an era of extraordinary achievement. Egyptian armies had pushed the empire's borders north into Canaan and Syria, south into Nubia, creating a tributary network that funneled the wealth of 3 continents into the Nile Valley. Egyptian temples rose to heights that still astonish modern engineers. Egyptian artists painted tomb walls with a vivid precision that preserves, 33 centuries later, the exact colors of flowers and birds and human faces that have otherwise long since turned to dust. At the center of this civilization was a theology of absolute authority. The pharaoh was not a human king who claimed divine approval. The pharaoh was a god, literally, constitutionally, by the theological framework that organized every aspect of Egyptian political, cultural, and economic life. The god Amun, whose great temple complex at Karnak was the wealthiest religious institution in the ancient world, stood at the apex of the Egyptian divine hierarchy. The priests of Amun were not merely religious functionaries. They were political powers of the first order, controlling wealth and land that rivaled the pharaoh's own, capable of making and unmaking rulers through the mechanism of divine oracle and priestly endorsement. It was into this world, this gilded, magnificent, theologically saturated, politically complex world, that Nefertiti stepped. Sometime around 1306 BC, she became the great royal wife of the pharaoh Amenhotep IV. And what followed was not the story of a beautiful woman elevated by marriage to a powerful man. What followed was the story of 2 extraordinary individuals, who, together, attempted something that no rulers in the history of the ancient world had attempted. The complete dismantling and reconstruction of an entire civilization's religious framework. From the ground up. In a single generation. By royal command. The priests of Amun would not forget. The forces of tradition would not forgive. And the erasure that followed, the systematic destruction of names and images and memories, tells us, more clearly than any inscription could, exactly how threatening the people who came after considered Nefertiti to have been. You do not erase someone from history, unless you are afraid of them. Her origins are a mystery. And mysteries, in ancient Egypt, are never accidental. The historical record preserves almost nothing about Nefertiti's birth, her family, her childhood, or the circumstances that brought her to the royal court of the 18th dynasty. This silence is itself significant, in an Egyptian royal tradition obsessed with recording genealogy and royal lineage. The absence of clear documentation about Nefertiti's background has generated centuries of scholarly debate and no definitive answers. Was she Egyptian? Was she foreign, a princess from the Mitanni kingdom in northern Syria? part of the elaborate system of diplomatic marriages that bound the great powers of the late Bronze Age together. Was she the daughter of the powerful court official who would eventually become pharaoh himself after the death of Tutankhamun? The evidence points in multiple directions without fully resolving. What the name tells us is suggestive. Nefertiti in the ancient Egyptian language, Nefertiti, means, the beautiful one has come. It is a name that carries within it a narrative arrival, beauty, transformation. Whether it was her birth name, or a name given to her upon entering the royal court, as was sometimes the practice with foreign diplomatic brides, who receive Egyptian names as part of their integration into the royal household. It announces something. It announces a presence. A force of nature arriving into a world that will never be the same. What we can reconstruct from the material record, from tomb paintings, from inscriptions, from the occasional administrative document, is a picture of a young woman entering the royal court of Amenhotep II, Nefertiti's future father-in-law, at some point in her adolescence. The court of Amenhotep II was one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan in Egyptian history, a place where foreign ambassadors mingled with Egyptian priests and officials, where diplomatic correspondence in the Akkadian language arrived from as far away as Babylon and Assyria, where art and architecture were being produced at a level of technical mastery that has never been surpassed. It was an environment that rewarded intelligence, cultural fluency, and political awareness. If I was indeed her father, and the evidence, while not conclusive, is suggestive, then Nefertiti grew up in the inner circles of power. I held the title, Father of the God, a designation that most scholars interpret as indicating he was the father-in-law of the pharaoh, i.e., the father of a great royal wife. He was a senior court official with decades of experience in the mechanisms of Egyptian governance, a man who understood the relationship between religious authority and political power with the refined sophistication of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating both. Growing up in his household, or in the royal court that he served, Nefertiti would have absorbed these lessons from childhood. She would have watched how power worked. She would have observed the relationship between the pharaoh and the priesthood. The delicate, perpetually negotiated balance between royal authority and religious institutional power that was the central dynamic of Egyptian political life. She would have seen how the priests of Amun exercised their influence, how they controlled the interpretation of divine will through oracle and ritual, how the accumulated wealth of the Amun temples gave the priesthood an economic independence that translated directly into political leverage. She would have understood, before she ever sat beside a pharaoh on the royal throne, that the priests of Amun were not simply religious figures. They were a competing power center. They were a constraint on royal authority. They were, from the perspective of a pharaoh who wished to rule absolutely, a problem. She also learned beauty as a political instrument. This requires careful understanding, not beauty in the trivial sense of physical appearance valued for its own sake, but beauty in the Egyptian theological sense, beauty as a divine attribute, as a marker of cosmic order, as an expression of Ma'at, the fundamental Egyptian concept of truth, justice, and universal order that was the foundation of both theological and political legitimacy. To be called beautiful in ancient Egypt was not merely a compliment. It was a theological statement. It connected the beautiful person to the divine order itself. The name Nefertiti was not describing a pretty face. It was describing a manifestation of cosmic order arriving in human form. Whether or not Nefertiti fully understood the implications of her own name, she inhabited it. She moved through the royal court of ancient Egypt, not as an ornament, but as a force, absorbing everything the environment could teach her about power, about religion, about the levers by which a civilization could be moved. She was being formed by a world of extraordinary sophistication, and she was forming herself into something that world had never quite seen before. When she married Amenhotep IV, the young crown prince who would become one of the most controversial and transformative rulers in all of Egyptian history, she was not simply entering a marriage. She was entering a partnership. A collaboration of two extraordinary minds aimed at a single, audacious, world-altering goal. They were going to change everything. The young pharaoh who took Nefertiti as his great royal wife was already, before he had done anything, a figure of contradiction and dangerous potential. Amenhotep IV was the second son of Amenhotep III, not the original heir, not the crown prince trained from birth for the throne, but the replacement, elevated to succession after the death of his older brother Thutmose. The circumstances of his early life before succession are obscure, but what the record suggests is a young man of intense intellectual and religious temperament, unusually to the cult of the Aten, the solar disk, a minor element in the existing Egyptian theological framework that represented the visible light and heat of the sun, as distinct from the hidden divine force that the god Ra or Amun, Ra embodied. The distinction matters enormously. Egyptian religious thought distinguished between the visible sun, the physical disk in the sky, the source of light and warmth, and the divine principle that animated it. The Aten was the former, the visible disk, the physical manifestation of solar power. Under normal Egyptian theological circumstances, it was a subordinate aspect of the solar religious complex, not an independent deity deserving of primary worship. But Amenhotep IV, perhaps from theological conviction, perhaps from political calculation, perhaps from some combination of both that cannot be fully separated, had developed a personal and intense relationship with the Aten that was about to reshape the world. And Nefertiti was at the center of it. Not as a passive recipient of her husband's religious enthusiasm, but as an active and equal participant, perhaps, some scholars argue, as the driving force behind the religious transformation that was about to unfold. In the early years of the reign, the tensions that would eventually explode into revolution were already building. The royal couple performed the traditional duties of a new pharaoh and his great royal wife. They oversaw temple rituals, received foreign ambassadors, commissioned monuments, appeared in the public ceremonies that connected the throne to the theological order that legitimized it. But simultaneously, construction was underway at Karnak, not the traditional Amun temple complex, but a new temple dedicated to the Aten, built in a new architectural style that departed deliberately from Egyptian tradition. Open to the sky rather than enclosed, flooded with sunlight rather than serving the mystery, called darkness that characterized traditional Egyptian sacred architecture. The priests of Amun noticed. They could not have failed to notice. A new temple at Karnak, dedicated to a different god. Built in a style that seemed almost designed to contrast with everything the Amun complex represented. This was not a subtle message. But the royal couple was careful, in these early years, to maintain the forms of traditional piety alongside the new innovation. The confrontation was building. It had not yet broken into the open. Nefertiti, in these years, was establishing herself in ways that went beyond what Egyptian queenship conventionally permitted. Egyptian royal art had always depicted the great royal wife in a subsidiary role, present beside the pharaoh, important but clearly secondary. Her scale in reliefs and paintings smaller than the pharaoh's, her religious functions supportive rather than independent. The art produced during the early years of Amenhotep IV's reign began to break these conventions with a quiet deliberateness that would accelerate into something far more radical. Nefertiti appeared beside her husband at equal scale. She appeared performing religious rituals that were traditionally reserved for the pharaoh alone. She appeared wearing the war crown, the blue Kepresh crown that was specifically a symbol of royal military authority. In contexts that were unambiguous about what they meant, she was not decorating the image of royal power. She was sharing it. She was an equal participant in the theological and political authority of the double throne. The couple had daughters, 6 of them, depicted in the royal art with a tender intimacy that was itself revolutionary in the context of traditional Egyptian royal imagery. Egyptian pharaohs were not typically depicted in domestic scenes, with their children, bouncing daughters on their knees, kissing them, holding them with visible affection. These images were not personal sentiment leaking into public art. They were theological statements about the nature of the royal family as the earthly embodiment of the divine family, and about the specific vision of divine order that Nefertiti and her husband were building together. The world was watching. The priests of Amun were watching. The courtiers and officials and military commanders who surrounded the throne were watching, calculating, trying to determine which way the wind was blowing and whether the new direction of the royal couple's theology would survive long enough to require their committed endorsement. The answer was coming. And it would come not gradually, but with the sudden, total Shocking completeness of a decision made by people who've been thinking about it for a very long time. In approximately the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV did something that the ancient world had never seen. He changed his name. Amenhotep, Amen is satisfied, became Akhenaten. He who is effective for the Aten. It was not a subtle shift, it was a declaration of theological war. By abandoning the name that contained the god Amun, by replacing it with a name that proclaimed exclusive devotion to the Aten, the pharaoh announced to every priest, every official, every literate person in Egypt who could read a royal cartouche that the old theological order was over. And then he went further. He founded a new city. On a stretch of previously uninhabited desert plain in Middle Egypt, a site bounded by desert cliffs on 3 sides and the Nile on the 4th. A site that belonged to no previous cult, no previous priesthood, no previous tradition. Akhenaten declared that the Aten itself had chosen the location and commanded its construction. The new city was called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. It is known today by the Arabic name Amarna, and it was not merely a new royal residence or a new administrative center. It was a new world. Nefertiti was at the center of its creation, in ways that the physical evidence makes unmistakable. At Amarna, the conventions of Egyptian royal art were not gradually modified. They were replaced wholesale with something entirely new. The Amarna art style that emerged from this revolutionary city is one of the most distinctive artistic movements in the entire history of human visual culture. Elongated limbs, naturalistic bodies, exaggerated facial features, domestic intimacy, sunlight flooding every composition. It was art designed not for the mysterious darkness of traditional Egyptian temples, but for the open-air courts of a new theology. A theology in which the divine was not hidden in inner sanctuaries behind locked doors, accessible only to priests, but visible to all, present in the sunlight that fell on every upturned face. Nefertiti, in this new world, was depicted with a frequency and a prominence that had no precedent in Egyptian history. She appeared on temple pylons, the monumental gateways of Egyptian sacred architecture, performing the traditional pharaonic act of smiting enemies. This was not a symbolic or decorative representation. The smiting of enemies was a ritual act of royal power, a demonstration of the pharaoh's capacity to maintain cosmic order against the forces of chaos. Only the pharaoh performed it. And yet here was Nefertiti, at the same monumental scale as Akhenaten, performing the same act. The theological implication was clear. She shared not merely the bed of the pharaoh, but the divine authority of the throne. Her titles multiplied and intensified. Rate of praises, Lady of Grace, Sweet of Love, Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. Each title was a layer of official acknowledgement of her status, and the accumulation of them went well beyond conventional queenly honorifics. She was being officially designated as a co-ruler, a partner in the divine authority that the Aten bestowed upon the royal couple jointly. The move to Amarna was total and deliberate. Akhenaten and Nefertiti abandoned the traditional capitals of Memphis and Thebes, abandoned the temples and administrative infrastructure that the old religious order had built over centuries, and established an entirely new center of power in the desert. Officials and courtiers were required to follow. The administrative machinery of one of the world's most sophisticated empires relocated itself to a city that had not existed 5 years earlier. The priests of Amun did not follow. They could not follow, because at Amarna, there was no place for them. The Aten theology that Akhenaten and Nefertiti were developing was not a new god added to the existing Egyptian theological framework. It was a monotheism, or something very close to it. The Aten was the one true divine power. The other gods Amun, Osiris, Isis, Horus, the entire magnificent Egyptian theological system developed over 2,000 years, were being systematically suppressed. Their temples were closed. Their names were chiseled from public monuments. Their images were defaced. The word Awan, even within words that had nothing to do with the god, even in private names, even in the name of Akhenaten's own father, was removed from inscriptions across Egypt. Workers were sent to Karnak and Luxor, and the great temples of Upper and Lower Egypt, climbing high on scaffolding to reach inscriptions that ordinary Egyptians would never have seen, carving out the name of the god that had anchored Egyptian civilization for centuries. This was not reform. This was revolution. And Nefertiti was not merely present for it, she was its embodiment. In the theology of Amarna, the divine family was the royal family, the Aten in the sky, Akhenaten on earth as the Aten sun and sole intermediary, and Nefertiti beside him as the female divine principle. The earthly manifestation of the goddess force that balanced and completed the male solar power. The theology required her to be powerful. The theology made her power not exceptional but essential. She rose to the absolute peak of what any woman had ever been allowed to be in ancient Egypt. And she was not finished rising. Amarna at its height was a city of approximately 50,000 people, built, inhabited, and abandoned within a single generation, leaving behind one of the most extraordinary archaeological records in the ancient world. It rose from the desert like a vision. Royal palaces of plastered mud brick and painted plaster, their walls covered in the intimate, revolutionary art of the new theology. Open, air temples where the Aten received offerings under the full sun, the altar heaped with food and flowers and fragrant resins, the divine light falling directly on the officiating priest, without the mediation of a dark inner sanctuary, or a carved cult statue. Elegant private villas with gardens and fish ponds, for the officials and courtiers, who had followed the court to the new capital. Workshops where sculptors and painters and craftsmen were producing the distinctive Amarna artistic style at an intensity and quality that has never been surpassed. In the great royal palace at the center of the city, Akhenaten and Nefertiti received ambassadors from across the ancient world, Babylonians, Assyrians, Mitannians, Nubians, Canaanites, Cypriots. In audience halls decorated with painted pavements, depicting nature scenes of birds and fish, and flowering plants so vivid that 19th century archaeologists who uncovered them wept at their beauty. The Amarna letters, the archive of diplomatic correspondence found at the site in 1887. Clay tablets inscribed in Akkadian recording the communications between Egypt and the great powers of the late Bronze Age, reveal an empire still functioning, still receiving tribute, still exercising the diplomatic dominance that Amenhotep II had built. But the letters also reveal something else. Something that suggests the revolutionary focus on Amarna's internal theological transformation was coming at a cost elsewhere. The Amarna letters contain increasingly desperate appeals from Egyptian vassal states in Canaan and Syria. City-state rulers writing to the pharaoh to report military attacks, requesting Egyptian military support, warning of the rising power of groups that the letters call the Haberu, people disrupting the Canaanite political order. The responses from Akhenaten's court are few, delayed and often inadequate. The empire's periphery was fraying. The theological revolution was consuming the attention and resources that should have been directed at maintaining the military and diplomatic infrastructure that held the empire together. Nefertiti's role in governance during these peak years was not merely ceremonial. The physical evidence from Amarna, administrative seals, inscriptions, the layout and function of palace spaces, suggest active executive participation. There are seal impressions bearing her cartouche associated with administrative functions that go beyond purely ritual activity. There are temples at Amarna that were under her specific patronage and direction. There is the famous window of appearances at the royal palace, the elevated window from which the royal couple publicly appeared to reward loyal officials with golden collars thrown down from the height of the palace wall, depicted in numerous tomb scenes showing Nefertiti beside Akhenaten, equal, visible, powerful, the face of the regime as much as her husband. The art of Amarna continued to evolve during these peak years, and its evolution tells a story that strict historical documentation cannot. In the early Amarna period, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were depicted together constantly, the divine couple, the earthly image of the Aten's creative force. As the reign progressed, Nefertiti began to appear in compositions where she was the central figure, not one of two equals. Her image grew larger, more commanding, more independent. The theological framework that had always positioned her as divine was being expressed, inward pushed toward a conclusion not quite yet reached, that Nefertiti herself was becoming the primary embodiment of royal and divine authority. She administered. She officiated. She appeared in military contexts that had no precedent for an Egyptian queen. She conducted the elaborate daily rituals of the Aten cult, that were the theological heartbeat of the new civilization they had built together. And she did all of this in a city that was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily beautiful. A deliberately constructed environment of light and color and naturalistic art that expressed, physically and aesthetically, the theology it was built to house. The peak of Amarna was real. The art was extraordinary. The theology was internally coherent and, in its own terms, profound. The administrative machinery of the empire continued to function. Egypt was still the most powerful single state in the ancient world. But beneath the painted pavements, beneath the sunlit altars, beneath the gracious diplomatic letters sent in perfect diplomatic Akkadian to the courts of Babylon and Mitanni, the forces that would destroy everything were gathering. And they were gathering quickly. The cracks appeared first at the edges of the empire, then at its center, then within the royal family itself. The Amarna letters become, as the reign progresses, increasingly alarming in their content. Rib-Hadda, the ruler of Byblos, a key Egyptian vassal on the Phoenician coast, wrote letter after letter to the Egyptian court, his tone shifting from formal diplomatic request to desperate pleading as his city came under attack, his population suffered, and his calls for military assistance went unanswered. He wrote to Akhenaten. He wrote to Nefertiti. He wrote to court officials. He described in vivid terms the collapse of Egyptian authority in Canaan, the defection of vassal rulers, the chaos spreading through the Levantine territories that Egypt had maintained as tributaries for generations. He received inadequate responses. His city eventually fell. This was not merely a diplomatic failure. It was a strategic catastrophe that revealed the deep structural cost of the Amarna revolution. The energy and attention that Akhenaten and Nefertiti had poured into building and managing a new religion, a new city, and a new theological order had come at the direct expense of the military and diplomatic infrastructure that held the empire together. The Egyptian army had not conducted major military campaigns in years. The network of client relationships in Canaan and Syria that Egyptian gold and Egyptian military presence had maintained was deteriorating. The Hittite Empire, to the north, was watching the weakness and preparing to exploit it. Within Egypt itself, the suppression of the traditional religion had created profound social tension. The priests of Amun and the other traditional cults had not disappeared. They had been dispossessed, their temples closed, their income streams interrupted, their theological authority denied. But they remained. They retained the loyalty of a population for whom the traditional gods were not merely official theology, but personal comfort, daily ritual, the framework of meaning within which ordinary lives were organized. The Aten theology, for all its philosophical sophistication, demanded that Egyptians abandon the gods who had walked with them through death and harvest and flood for 2,000 years. The demand was not universally or enthusiastically met. And then came the year that historians call year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, a year preserved in Amarna art as a moment of extraordinary, almost desperate public magnificence. A great ceremony was held at Amarna, attended by tribute delegations from across the known world, Nubians, Canaanites, Syrians, Libyans, Aegeans, bringing tribute and gifts and acknowledgement of Egyptian imperial supremacy. It was the largest public ceremony of the reign, a deliberate demonstration of power and reach at the very moment when power and reach were beginning to fail. The art records it in magnificent detail. The political reality behind it was more ambiguous. After year 12, the historical record around Nefertiti becomes suddenly and dramatically strange. She disappears from the Amarna official record. Not gradually, suddenly. The woman who had appeared on virtually every significant monument of the reign, who had been depicted at equal scale with the pharaoh on temple pylons, who had her own dedicated temples, her own administrative seals, her own theological function at the very core of the Aten cult, simply stops appearing. The explanations proposed by scholars span the full range of historical possibility. She died of plague, perhaps, which is known to have struck Egypt during this period with devastating effect. She fell from favor, the result of some political rupture with Akhenaten, some theological or personal disagreement that broke the partnership that had been the engine of the Amarna revolution. Or, and this is the theory that has gained increasing scholarly attention over recent decades, she did not disappear at all. She transformed, because precisely at the moment Nefertiti vanishes from the record, a new figure appears, Nefertiti, a co-regent, bearing a throne name that had previously been used as one of Nefertiti's epithets, depicted with the full regalia of pharaonic authority, functioning as co-ruler with Akhenaten in the final years of his reign. The evidence studied by Egyptologists including James Allen, Mark Gabold and others, points, with increasing conviction, toward a conclusion almost too dramatic to absorb. Nefertiti did not disappear. She was elevated. She became pharaoh, or something functionally equivalent, while her husband lived, ruling beside him as co-regent with full royal authority. If true, it is the single most extraordinary career trajectory in the history of ancient Egypt. And the personal stakes of that transformation, in a court full of people whose power depended on understanding and correctly navigating the direction of royal authority, were absolute. Akhenaten died around 1336 BC. The exact circumstances are unknown. The records that might have clarified them were systematically destroyed by the people who came afterward. What is known is that he ruled for approximately 17 years, and that when he died, the revolutionary civilization, he and Nefertiti, had built already beginning to come apart. What happened in the immediate aftermath of Akhenaten's death is one of the most contested questions in the whole of Egyptology. The succession of rulers in the period between Akhenaten's death and the secure establishment of Tutankhamun, the boy king who would become, through the accident of his tomb's survival intact, the most famous Egyptian ruler in the modern world, is a tangle of fragmentary evidence, disputed identities, and scholarly arguments that have been running for generations, without definitive resolution. The pharaoh Nefertiti, who may be Nefertiti, appears to have ruled Egypt as sole pharaoh, or regent for a period of approximately 2 to 3 years after Akhenaten's death. If this identification is correct, then Nefertiti achieved something that only a handful of women in all of Egyptian history had managed. She became pharaoh in her own right, bearing the full royal titulary, exercising the full authority of the double crown. Hatshepsut had done it in the 15th century BC, Sobekneferu had done it in the Middle Kingdom. Nefertiti, if she is indeed Nefertiti, did it in the 14th century BC, and she did it in the eye of a political storm that was about to tear her life's work apart. Because the counter-revolution was coming. The forces that Akhenaten and Nefertiti had suppressed. The priests of Amon, the traditional religious establishment, the military commanders whose authority had been overshadowed by the radical theology of Amarna, the officials whose careers depended on the institutional structures the Aten revolution had disrupted, were regrouping. The courtier who may have been Nefertiti's own father, was maneuvering for position. Horemheb, the powerful military general who would eventually become pharaoh himself, was consolidating military support. The end of Amarna was not a sudden collapse. It was a negotiated unraveling, each step taken by men who understood that the extraordinary experiment of the Aten revolution had run its course. The child Tutankhaten, the name itself a marker of the transition that was coming, he was called the living image of the Aten, became pharaoh, almost certainly as a very young boy, with regents managing his rule. Almost immediately, his name was changed to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amen. The signal could not have been clearer. Amen was returning, the old gods were returning. Egypt was going home, Amarna was abandoned. The beautiful city that Nefertiti and Akhenaten had built from desert sand was emptied. The royal court returned to the traditional capitals. The Amun temples were reopened, restored, and lavishly refunded. The priests returned to their sanctuaries. The traditional theology resumed its place at the center of Egyptian civilization, as if it had never been interrupted. Or rather, as if it was determined to ensure that what had interrupted it would be not just ended, but erased. The erasure was systematic and thorough. Akhenaten's name was removed from inscriptions. His image was defaced. The great temples of Amarna were dismantled, their stones reused in other construction, their inscriptions destroyed. The royal tombs at Amarna were opened, the mummies removed and taken, somewhere. The fate of Akhenaten's body is unknown. The fate of Nefertiti's body was unknown for decades after her existence was rediscovered. Nefertiti herself, her fate after the period of her potential sole rule, is simply unknown. She may have died during the short reign of Nefertiti. She may have lived into the reign of Tutankhamun as a royal elder. Her power diminished but her presence still felt. A mummy discovered in the tomb of Amenhotep II, known as the Younger Lady, KV35YL, has been proposed by some scholars, on the basis of DNA analysis and physical characteristics, as a possible candidate for Nefertiti's remains. The identification is disputed. Everything about Nefertiti's final years is disputed, because the people who came after her worked very hard to ensure that dispute would be all that remained. They almost succeeded, On December 6, 1912, a German archaeological team working in the ruins of the ancient city of Amarna, the abandoned desert capital that had lain buried and largely forgotten for 33 centuries, uncovered a limestone bust in the rubble of a sculptor's workshop. The excavation was led by Ludwig Borchardt, working under the auspices of the Deutsche Orient Gesellschaft. Borchardt, trained in the careful understatement of German academic archaeology, recorded the discovery in his field notes with a phrase that became famous: "Description is useless. See for yourself." The bust was taken to Germany. It was kept in private hands for years before entering the public museum system. A journey marked by accusations, which have never been fully resolved, that its export from Egypt had been facilitated by a misleading description on the official inventory that understated its significance and beauty. Egypt has been requesting its return ever since. Germany has refused. The dispute over the bust of Nefertiti is one of the emotionally charged conversations in the ongoing global argument about colonial-era archaeological extraction and the repatriation of cultural heritage. The dispute itself is a form of tribute. The world fights over Nefertiti because Nefertiti matters. Because the face in that limestone bust, staring with those painted eyes across 33 centuries of war and empire and revolution and forgetting, refuses to become merely an artifact. It insists on being a presence. But what is that presence? Who was Nefertiti, really, underneath the beauty, and the mystery and the erasure? She was, the evidence increasingly suggests, one of the most powerful women who ever lived. Not merely powerful for a woman in the ancient world, powerful in absolute terms, by the standards of any world. She co-designed and co-administered a religious and political revolution that restructured one of history's greatest civilizations from the ground up. She governed an empire of millions while that revolution was at its height. She may have ruled that empire alone, as sole pharaoh, at the most critical moment of its history. And she was erased, her name carved from stone, her images defaced, her memory suppressed by people who understood correctly that what she represented was dangerous to the order they were trying to restore. The erasure is, in a tragic sense, the ultimate confirmation of her power. You do not spend that much effort erasing someone who didn't matter. You do not climb scaffolding in the dark to cut a name from a temple ceiling unless that name, still visible, still legible, still connected to the memory of the person who bore it, represents a threat. The thoroughness of the attempt to destroy Nefertiti is the clearest evidence we have of how completely she had succeeded in being real. The Amarna revolution, the theological experiment she and Akhenaten conducted, did not survive them. The return to Amun was swift, thorough and apparently enthusiastic. Within a generation of Akhenaten's death, it was as if the revolution had never happened, or was being officially maintained to have never happened. The pharaohs who followed referred to Akhenaten not by name but as the criminal of Amarna, a deliberate demonization that stripped him of both his royal and personal identity. And yet the revolution did leave traces. Traces that scholars have followed into the most unexpected places. The theology of the Aten, the singular divine power, present in light, accessible without priestly intermediary, sustaining all life through its radiance, has been compared by religious historians to the theological innovations of the biblical tradition, particularly to the emergence of monotheism in ancient Israelite religion. The connections are debated, the causal links disputed. But the chronological proximity is undeniable. Imana period and the emergence of the Hebrew Bible's monotheistic tradition belong to the same century, the same region, the same intellectual environment. Something was in the air in the 14th century BC, in the eastern Mediterranean and the Nile Valley. Akhenaten and Nefertiti breathed it, shaped it, and launched it into history. The Amarna art style, despite being suppressed and destroyed, also left traces. Elements of its naturalistic energy, its intimacy, its willingness to depict the human form in motion and in emotional engagement, survived in the art of the subsequent Ramesside period, muted and conventionalized but present. Beauty once imagined at a certain level of vividness, does not entirely disappear. Today, Tel El Amarna, the modern Arabic name for the site of the ancient city of Akhenaten, is an active archaeological site, continuously yielding new information. The Amarna project, under the direction of Barry Kemp and his successors, has been excavating the site for decades, uncovering not just the royal quarters and the temples, but the houses of ordinary workers and artisans. The cemeteries where the people who built the revolutionary city were buried. The physical traces of the lives that were lived in Nefertiti's city, by people who were not kings or priests or queens, but simply human beings. Doing what human beings have always done, working, loving, hoping, dying, in the shadow of an extraordinary and doomed experiment. The bust of Nefertiti remains in Berlin. Egypt continues to ask for it back. The argument about who owns the past, who has the right to hold and display the material evidence of a civilization's existence, continues to be argued in galleries and museums and international forums. Unresolved, perhaps unresolvable. And the face continues to look out from behind its museum glass with that expression, serene, knowing, almost amused by all the noise. The face of a woman who was erased from history, so thoroughly that 33 centuries passed before the world remembered she had ever existed. The face of a woman who came back anyway. Because you cannot erase someone like Nefertiti. You can try. You can chisel her name from every surface you can reach. You can demolish her city and scatter her stones, and reuse them in other temples for other gods. You can take her mummy from its tomb and hide it in an unmarked chamber, and let 3,000 years of silence do their work. And then a German archaeologist reaches into the rubble of a sculptor's workshop on a December afternoon in 1912. And the face looks up at him. And the world holds its breath. She came back. And this time nobody is going to make her disappear.